Hey, what is going on everybody, and welcome to Fantasia. For today, we're going to be jumping into another session of Epic 7. Now today, got another tier list for you guys. Now this tier list here, I'm going to start with a disclaimer, is purely from my perspective, and for reference, I am currently a top 2000 player, ranked in the high champions of the current season, and I typically play with a standard slash control slash tank down play style. I don't really go aggro and I never really cleave, although I am familiar with these two styles because of matching up into them. So this tier list is going to be subjective, obviously, like all tier lists are, and I will give you my reasoning for each of the units and their placements. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the actual tiers on this list. I've broken down this tier list into 6 different categories: S, A, B, C, D, and E. The S tier represents units that are very strong. These are units that are very impactful in the meta with what they do, what they offer to the team, and their flexibility and versatility as early pick units. The next tier, we have the A tier, which is the above average tier. Typically, units in this category aren't necessarily going to be first pick units because they don't offer as much versatility as those in S. However, they do offer a strong basis of support, either in offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities, or sometimes a mix of both. Next up, we have the B tier, which is the average category. The units in this category are kind of weaker than the ones in S and A, but they definitely hold their own, and they're typically better as like 4th or 5th pick units, or if you pick them with the intention of kind of rounding out your team comp. Moving on, we have the C tier. Now, it can be said that the B, C, and D tiers on this list can be interchangeable or even mixed together into one big tier. However, I tried to break things down a little bit more so that you have a more nuanced kind of view of these units and kind of how I view them when I'm going into drafts. The C tier is the niche category, so these are units that specialize in one specific thing or function really well under narrow circumstances. This can be used to facilitate or support a specific playstyle, or these can be used to initiate encounters with your opponent that kind of force your opponent to ban these units because they actually carry quite a bit of counterplay to what your opponent currently has in draft. Next up, we have the D tier, which I would consider the pocket pick tier. The units in this category are mostly uncommon. You won't expect to see any of these units when you queue up in draft. However, these units can offer a pretty good counterplay to some of the other units that are in the tiers above. They're just up to player preference and how you build them. A lot of these units can actually be built in kind of unique ways so that you can surprise your opponent, essentially. Next up, we have the E tier, what I would consider kind of suboptimal. There can be better options in the tiers above, but I'll break down those units as we get to them. Alright, so with the breakdown of all the tiers out of the way, let's jump into the first tier, the S tier. Now, starting off this batch here, we of course have to have the newest unit that's added to the roster of Epic 7, New Moon Luna. So New Moon Luna here is super strong. She has 2 of arguably the strongest debuffs in the current meta right now, which are Seal and Unbuffable. Seal is very strong because so many units nowadays carry a passive ability, and Luna can just shut them down entirely through the whole team without having to attack. Now, the non-attack skill can be kind of a detriment, but the upsides of her on the team are so strong that they kind of vastly outweigh the negatives. She can also easily be countered by cleansers, but you gotta realize that this is a team-based game, and with that, she's gonna have 4 allies in draft that can definitely be used to counter your counter picks. But New Moon Luna's Unbuffable is also very good because it prevents the opponent from getting unique buffs on them, for example, Sea Phantom Politis' buffs, right, or for example, Blood Moon Haste buffs. But we'll get to those units later. New Moon Luna is just very oppressive. She can be used in pretty much every playstyle, standard, aggro, and cleave. If you're playing standard, you're probably not ripping your S3 immediately because you're facing off against a lot of cleansers, but if you're going aggro or you're going cleave, you probably have bridge units that you can use to close the gap between New Moon Luna and your follow-ups, which means that you're probably going to end up destroying everybody with little to no counterplay because of her seal. Anyway, that's a lot of time spent on New Moon Luna, but she, despite being a new unit, has definitely solidified her place as a top contender in this meta. Next up, we have Sea Phantom Politis. As you guys know, she is a very commonly pre-banned unit, but she is also a very strong unit whenever she's let through. That's because when she is picked, she completely shuts down like Fighting Spirit and Focus Gain units. She halves their gain of those meters, and that really shuts down those units and their kits entirely, right? Not many units exist out there that don't care about their focus or fighting spirit meters, especially because most of their stronger skills are locked behind those thresholds. Now, Sea Phantom Politis is very strong because she actually gives a rage buff, which gives attack and speed, and rage is really strong when used with units like Genua, but we'll get to him later. Next up, we have Knockwall. Knockwall is also a very versatile opener. Now, she can be compared to New Moon Luna, although they do kind of function a little bit differently. Knockwall can't hold her own book like New Moon Luna, but she can reset the opponent's team, kind of giving your team a lot of tempo. New Moon Luna doesn't offer a lot of team tempo. She does offer a lot of self-tempo with her CR pushes. Knockwall, however, even if the opponents cleanse her bind debuff, they're going to be set back a turn, especially when she soul burns and ignores resistance. She also has a really short cooldown on her S2, which allows her to seal. While it's only one target at a time, the seal is applied before she attacks, so you can actually seal ice units very easily. Knockwall is a very versatile unit, and she's actually used a lot in standard play too, so even though she's faster and you can use her as an initiator for aggro teams or cleave teams to kind of bind your opponent, make sure they can't counterattack, she can also be used in standard v standard mirror matches as well, and she's very strong as a band protection unit too. Moving forward, speaking of cleave and aggro, we have Zeo. Zeo is undeniably a super strong character because he can easily shut down any of your opponent's aggressive plays if they don't pick him, right? He's countered by stealth units, so things like ML Politis, Sea Phantom Politis. She starts the match with stealth, so Zeo cannot really be used to counter her, but Zeo is used to counter a lot of other units. He's arguably a little bit weaker. You can argue that he's an A tier because a Sea Phantom Politis and New Moon Luna both are not really impacted by Zeo's first turn with his S3, and a lot of units like Knockwall, for example, start with stealth as well because of Guiding Light. But even then, Zeo can be used to attack bridge units. Zeo can be used to disrupt a lot of other plays that are used to follow up these openers. Okay, next up we have Ron. Ron has actually started to become a bigger issue now with band protection in the drafts. So Ron here actually offers several different things for the team. One, he offers a team-wide immunity buff along with having the highest base speed in the game tied with K-Ron. And Ron also offers a soul burn, ignore resistance, defense break, and stigma debuff on the opponent. Stigma cuts healing and combat readiness gain in half, which allows you to kind of shut down your opponents in their counterplay, especially if they're trying to cut you on the combat readiness meter with things like Eternus, Soul Consolation, or even units like Dilibet or Sage Ball. But Ron, with his defense break, is probably the strongest element in this, in terms of his kit, because he enables a lot of his follow-up units, his bridge units, to easily destroy your team, a staple in a lot of cleave and aggro players' team comps. Next up, we have one of my favorite units in the game, but also seems to be relevant in the meta. He's very, very oppressive, Death Dealer Ray. While he can be countered by some units, but keep in mind, with like ML Luna, this is a team-based game, so you can easily play around a lot of those counters, or you can just draft a team in which those counters get obliterated in. So he is a very versatile unit as well. I've seen him used as anchors in aggro and cleave teams. If you're not not familiar with what an anchor is a unit that's typically a bit bulkier, a bit more supportive, a little less damage than usual, or no damage at all in the form of Death Dealer Ray, and they're used to kind of be a failsafe. If you can't kill all of your opponents immediately in your first few turns with an aggro cleave playstyle, you have this one unit that kind of follows up and either cleans up the match, or they end up suppressing your opponent so that you get another wave, you get a second wind to try again with your next turn. Right, Death Dealer Ray is great at that because he has a team-wide sleep, he doesn't need to hit anybody directly, and he has a lot of injury, he has venom, he has damage built into his kit with detonation of injury damage. He's just an overall, all-around solid unit. His S2 also brings a lot of tempo to the team, so if you're countering him with something like Moon Bunny, or if you're countering him with somebody like ML Sharoon, then he can get around that while still providing your team turn cycling, which kind of enables your damage dealers to go and take down those counter picks so that on DDR's subsequent turns he can use his S3 unhindered. Moving on, we have Albedo. So, with this unit being up here, in my opinion, she is super solid. While she does have a seemingly boring kit, and a lot of players wanted a buff for her back when she was first released, Albedo is very strong in terms of countering stealth units, really squishy units. She's good as an anti-cleave unit, solid as a standard pick, just to kind of tank down for your team. She mitigates a lot of damage. She can be a counter pick into things like Midnight Galililius, which is a very common anti-tank down unit, right, to cleave through your team. Albedo punishes those types of teams, and she also draws a lot of aggro onto herself. If a teammate is crit, that's not her directly, then she will unleash an AoE S2, which, as I mentioned, helps you break units out of stealth, helps deal a lot of damage with 3F if she's holding that as her artifact, and it also strips some buffs too, which is very useful. Albedo is typically built a bit faster nowadays, with effectiveness rather than being slow and tanky on counter with resist, although both playstyles do work. She is just very versatile as a pick and can easily shut down more aggressive plays, while also contributing enough chip damage that she can be used in standard v standard matchups too. Next up, we have Ambitious Tywin. This man has seen a rise and fall in metas past. He was originally part of the Golden Boys meta. He fell off when Green Landy became a thing. He started coming back in previous metas against things like Aravi and such who were weak to CC, and then he fell off again when Midnight Galililius got released, but now he's back. And he's back because he provides cleansing without having to use cleansing skills. Once per turn, whenever he's hit, he can cleanse the team of 1 debuff, and that is very powerful, especially when you have units that lock down non-attack skills, which we'll get to later. But as you guys know, it's Celine. Ambitious Tywin, though, is really consistent. He also has Ignore Resistance when he does cleanse and he gets the rage buff on himself, allowing him to provide defense breaks and stuns on an AoE level to the entire team on the other side. Now, it is some RNG, he is not 100% chance, but both of those debuffs are strong enough that landing one of them is usually enough to snag you a win. Alright, next up we have Blood Moon Haste. So Blood Moon Haste, after his buff, he went from completely irrelevant to almost forgotten into a very, very oppressive, very annoying unit because of his sustaining and healing capabilities. Blood Moon Haste here is so strong at healing, especially with the Celestine artifact, that with a couple of good RNG procs, when he counters and he does a follow-up attack with extra attack and strips a buff, right? He can heal up his team from pretty much like almost dead to full HP, and he's very consistent with it as well, which is why he's kind of knocked other Soul Weavers off of the meta, right? You see things like Destina kind of falling off, even though she was very, very strong, even like a season and a half ago, right? 2 seasons ago. She was very prominent, very dominant in the meta, but Blood Moon Haste has completely replaced those need for traditional Soul Weavers because he deals damage, strips buffs, and heals the team. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't really carry much in terms of a cleanse, but you have teammates for that typically. Blood Moon Haste also, when your teammate dies, he will get a unique buff to him that increases effectiveness and allows him to double his damage on his S3. His passive allows him to penetrate defense, so when he attacks with his S3, you're dealing upwards of 20k plus damage, and it's usually gonna kill. If he kills, you get a full team revive buff. With immortality, it's kind of insane, right? So Blood Moon Haste has kind of replaced traditional revivers as well as traditional healers in this current meta. Right, so moving on, we have one of the best cleansers in the game, Laia. She's also the most common pick up in the Legend tier. In Champion and Emperor, she's actually still pretty highly picked, and she's really commonly picked right now because of New Moon Luna. Laia doesn't care about New Moon Luna, and New Moon Luna doesn't provide the team any tempo, doesn't push up the team or anything unless you have bridge units, so Laia, typically built pretty fast, 270 speed, can be used to cleanse the debuffs off of your team, no seals for anybody, and you can enable your team to go forward. Her artifact Sweet Miracle also allows her to not be controlled herself, so unlike traditional cleansers, let's say like a Destina or somebody, if you get stunned, you lose that turn and you can't really do anything. Laia, on the other hand, if she's stunned, silenced, or slept, she will be able to cleanse one turn off the duration of those debuffs, and most of those debuffs have a duration of 1 turn, and then she can go ahead and cleanse everybody on your team. She provides a lot of tempo with dual attacks, CR pushing as well, and her S3, once it fully charges up and is off cooldown, can be soul burned to deal upwards of 20k plus damage as well, depending on how much HP you build her as. She's really tanky too, which allows her to fit perfectly into standard team comps, and she's actually used quite often with slower units because she provides tempo with her dual attacks, namely units like Navy Captain Landy. Alright, next up we have Dragon Bride Senya. So Dragon Bride Senya, also a newer unit added to the game in recent months, she is really strong because of her insane mitigation. People used to compare her to units like Last Rider Crow, but she has shown that she is far superior in terms of what she provides. She is way tankier, she has a higher amount of HP that allows her to stay on the field for longer. People are building her with things like Proof of Valor nowadays as well, just to allow her to survive, or Holy Sacrifice, because she is usually the focus of a lot of your opponent's aggression. Her S3 is not only a really strong damage dealing skill, but it resets if the person in the back line falls below half health. When that happens, she also gives a huge barrier to them, providing even more mitigation, and does a full cleanse of herself and the backline unit, which is absolutely insane. On the same note as kind of like a Tywin, she provides cleansing to the team without providing traditional cleansing in the form of non-attack skills. So, very useful in that. She's also coupled with very oppressive DPS units in the back, or even with Blood Moon Haste himself, because if you kill Dragon Bride Senya, Blood Moon Haste will get his buff and he can destroy your team and revive her, or if you put Blood Moon Haste in the back and your opponent's focusing him, then Dragon Bride Senya will proc, she'll get another really strong AoE S3 into your team as opposed to a single target one, and she penetrates defense too, so she's gonna deal quite a bit of damage. Especially if you're fighting an aggro build as well, kind of a stronger, not usually used in aggro teams, but a stronger, more aggressive Dragon Bride Senya with a 3F artifact, she's going to be chipping away at your team throughout the fight. Now, as opposed to chipping away at your opponent, we have Genua, who is arguably one of the strongest DPS units in the game right now, especially when he has the rage buff. He can slice through even the tankiest of units in a single S1 into an extra attack combo, and he is incredibly powerful because of his self-attack buff, his defense penetration on his extra attack and his S3, and his ability to cleanse and have immortality, which grants him survivability. Genua's really annoying to deal with, which is why you have a lot of people picking things like seal units like Knockwall or ML Luna into him, or you might even see a rising of ice units in the meta to counter him as well. It is difficult though, because ice units are kind of in a weird position where they don't have too many good offensive options, but Genua right now, it's his time to shine, and he is a really strong pick into these tankier units. He can obliterate units like Blood Moon Haste, Laia, Dragon Bride Senya, a Tywin Albedo, but he is kind of weak though into units that he might not be able to consistently hit. And of course, units that can seal and strip. The unbuffable debuff is also really strong against him. Alright, moving on, we have the Urban Shadow Shoe. So I personally think that she is an S tier unit. She has very few bad matchups. In fact, her bad matchups are usually just people who are more aggressive and can destroy her right before she takes turns, but in a standard v standard matchup, she's almost uncontested. She has one of the best injury kits in the game, probably on par with that of DDR, right, if not just slightly below him, and she has consistent damage applications, consistent injury applications, which makes her matchup against HP scalers really good. She has a really strong S3 that detonates based on injury damage, kind of like DDR's S1, but on a much greater scale, and she can be built with a variety of different builds. Right now, there's the traditional build where you're going a little bit of crit damage, 100% crit, very fast shoes, right? Some shoes are upwards of 280 to 300 speed, okay? Even though most shoes on average are like 250 to 270 speed, you see outliers that are really fast. She is also now being built on really high resistance with Bastion of Hope to increase that resistance even further to make sure that her only main weakness, getting controlled or getting unbuffable on her, doesn't happen, right, without soul burns or ignore resistance skills. So Urban Shadow Shu is definitely very versatile, very strong, and punishing to a lot of these tankier HP scalers in the current meta. But that's gonna do it for the S tier. Alright, so moving on, we have the A tier, the above average category. And the first unit in this category is gonna be C. Lilius. C. Lilius, along with units like Peyra and Lua, are very strong contenders for first picks. Now, they do get kind of outshadowed by C. Phantom Politis and things like Noctwall, Ron Zio, or even New Moon Luna, but these units offer a lot of versatility to the draft as well. Lua is slightly worse than Noctwall in my opinion overall, because while she can increase the cooldowns of your opponent's units, allowing your team to get a little bit of tempo, she does lack the seal that Noctwall has. She does have a sleep, but the sleep in general is not going to be as effective as seal, which is why I ranked her a little bit lower. She's also less seen as a counter pick rather than, she's better as like an enabler, an initiator for your own team's tempo than it is to kind of counterpick into your opponent and kind of shut them down, right? Because Noctwall has bind and seal, whereas Lua really just resets the opponent, puts some beguile for some chip damage, and puts people to sleep, allowing your team to hopefully turn cycle faster and regain your footing. C. Lilius and Peyra in general, though, are really good openers. Peyra carries Unbuffable, which again we noted was really strong to things like C. Phantom Politis, into units like Blood Moon Haste, Genoa, Urban Shadow Shu, even very strong overwhelming debuffs onto units like A. Tywin, so he can't cleanse very consistently, especially if you pair Peyra with other debuffers. C. Lilius is the same thing. She can be used to counter certain fast units as well. You can see her kind of countering things like Benevolent Roman when he's used as a counter pick into C. Phantom Politis. Her provoke is still very strong, and if you soul burn it, it's a 2-turn redirected provoke. Redirected provoke also means that Conquer Lilius, when she dies, the provoke doesn't get cleansed immediately because it's always going to be attacking that unit with the highest HP, regardless of if that highest HP unit leaves the field or not. Right, so C. Lilius is very strong. She also adds good tempo, kind of like Laya does with her dual attacks. It is random like Laya's, so you typically pair her with units that are strong in extra attacks and gain extra benefits from it, like Navy Captain Landy. But yeah, in general, Vigor buff is also really good, just kind of not as strong right now because there are a lot better openers at the moment, but still has a very solid place. Next up, we have Requiem Rowana. She is actually a unit that follows up a lot of openers really well, and what we're seeing as a trend here is a lot of people are ban protecting a fast unit and then picking Requiem Rowana as a 4th pick. So, for example, your Zio cannot be contested by going first, and even though Zio can't hit things that are stealth, like Noctwall, C. Phantom Politis, or even affect units like New Moon Luna, what you can do with Zio is enable Requiem Rowana to go after him, and you will use her to strip a buff from the opponent, as well as push them back in their combat readiness, and reset their skills by a turn by increasing their cooldowns, kind of like Noctwall and Lua. Wrecker and Moana got buffed to be able to strip a single buff off the opponent, so even if they have immunity and they are stealth, when Wrecker and Moana hits them, she'll strip the immunity and then reset their cooldowns, essentially buying your team some time. So she is a really good combo piece to use in aggro and cleave setups. She is also used sometimes when people pivot from standard into more aggro or cleave teams, so she is really good as a bridge unit there. Next up, we have this dynamic duo, Abyssal Euphine and Navy Captain Landy. Abyssal Euphine with her passive, kind of shutting down the opponent's combat readiness gain, really good. She's also very solid overall as a decent ship damage unit until she gets her S3, so your opponent's kind of on a timer for how long they can survive against her. She does have blatant weaknesses though. If you have a good counter unit and Abyssal Euphine attacks when she's in the enraged state, and that unit counters or Elbrises, she can die really easily because she's pretty much defense broken when she is in her traumatized state. But overall, she does have a decent win rate. It's not amazing in this current meta. She was probably definitely stronger in the previous season, but as of right now, she's still a very strong pick. She's good in standard, for slower playstyles. She's also good as a counter pick into more aggressive playstyles where they're using things like maybe Wrecker and Moana to try to cut in combat readiness. She has that Politis passive after all. Next up, Navy Captain Landy, self-explanatory. The reason why I wouldn't put her in S tier is that while she is really good as like an anti-cleave unit, while she's pretty good as a standard v standard matchup, and can sometimes be used as an anchor or like a first pick unit for these more cleave or aggro-oriented teams, right, to kind of disguise your intentions and then you start going really fast with Navy Captain Landy as a cleanup unit. She does rely a lot on RNG, so that RNG, same with Abyssal Euphine if you're on Elbris, that RNG can come back to bite you sometimes, and she does have enough counter picks nowadays that she's not necessarily fully safe. You have things like Knockwall that can easily counter her, Sea Phantom Politis that halves your fighting spirit gain, you have Elvira, you have units that can guarantee crits like ML Bologna or Fire Ravi, so she's kind of fallen off a little bit in the meta. However, still a very common pick because people can rely on her for that RNG factor. Okay, next up, no RNG involved here with these two knights because Crimson Armin and Unbound Knight Arwell are both really strong damage mitigation units, probably some of the best mitigation units in the game, despite being 4 stars and 3 stars respectively. Crimson Armin has the best mitigation in the entire game because she can hold Aureus, and her passive reduces 16% of damage from all sources, whether they're crits or not, making it better than things like Adamant Shield or even Albedo's passive, which only reduces critical hit damage. Arwell is also really strong because of her escort buff, absorbing more damage than Aureus would, but it does come with the downside of being able to get stripped. So if there are strong debuffers on the opponent's side and they decide to strip the Arwell's buff, she is no longer providing that mitigation to the team. She does have good tempo though. When another unit is attacked with a single target attack, she does push herself up, kind of like a built-in Helag Lance, which is kind of good. She also carries a stun and a full buff strip on her S3, along with a giant barrier to the entire team, which is good for mitigation overall. Whereas Crimson Armin, with being built slower and usually on a protection set, will provide the same kind of barrier bonus at the start of the match. However, she does have an S3 that provides immunity, a very valuable debuff right now, very valuable buff right now, as well as invincibility to the entire team, protecting everyone for a turn. And if you pair her with units like Laia from the S tier category, you have Laia who can push up a slower Crimson Armin, and after the rest of your team goes, Crimson Armin S3s protects everybody, and so your opponent essentially wastes their whole first turn attacking into invincible units. It's a pretty good combo. Or you can use her in certain scenarios to safely enable your DPS units to attack into things that might be countering you, such as Navy Captain Landy or Abyssal Euphine, allowing them to survive turns that they normally wouldn't. Next up for the Knights, we have Bellion. Do I need to say more? Bellion's a floodgate to all soul gain. So she is there to essentially stop units like New Moon Luna from soul burning. You can stop mages with Book, namely things like Zio, or other aggressive units like Wrecker and Moana from having those souls to destroy your team. She can protect high-res units from having that resistance ignored. She is also a good enabler of damage if you build on counter or maybe even Elbris. She's She's a good source of damage mitigation because some people are building her on protection set with Aureus with no speed and as a very tanky unit to kind of sit there. She does have self-healing in her kit, she has self-defense buffing, she has AoE attacks, she has an AoE provoke, and she has a bunch of debuffs with her extra attack on her S1, which has a chance to proc an extra attack whenever you use it. Now, the thing about Bellion is that she is kind of vulnerable to certain units like ML Ken and such. She can't help but AoE, so she can be taken advantage of by units that might counterattack more often. So units like Navy Captain Landy can easily use her Elbrus and counter set to their advantage against units like Bellion. But do keep in mind that she can be pretty versatile as well. She can be built on things like Injury Set and not have Elbrus on her, right? So that she doesn't counter, she doesn't really proc a lot of these other effects that you might see from units like Bibulus, and you can still inflict a lot of damage against HP scalers in a standard v standard matchup. She doesn't have to be used as an anti-cleave unit. Alright, next up we have Abigail. Abigail is actually quite unique here because she actually provides a lot of utility to the team while also being pretty good with tempo and just kind of damage in general. She inflicts injury, she has a defense break in her kit with the right EE. She has some tempo in the S1 where you attack, there's a chance for you to push up your team as well, and her passive is very strong because whenever someone in the back line would take fatal damage, she can actually prevent that and grant them vampirism and immortality, which is very strong, allowing them to stay in the fight. And it's really good in a protect the tower team comp, where you have one DPS in the backline that you're protecting with everybody else, and under the right circumstances, as long as that DPS survives, right, the initial fatal blow, typically you have a couple turns to recover before the unit on the opponent's side is off their cooldown on that skill to attack again. Next up, we have Arya. So Arya is here in the A tier because she actually kind of destroys Genoa. Despite him being res or not, she's actually paired really well with units like Abigail, just in case Genoa gets lucky hits on her, but Arya in general is very good for punishing single target damage dealers and teams that really don't have any debuffs or strips on them. Right? She has a really strong counter buff, she has a focus gain that allows her to do an extra attack when she reaches max, and she does quite a bit of damage, especially if you put her on Fairy Tale for a Nightmare. But again, she's a mage, so you can be pretty versatile with what artifact you do put on her. You can put extra resistance with Bastion of Hope and the like. But yeah, she overall just skyrocketed into popularity because of Genoa, and she's kind of just stayed there overall. Pretty versatile, pretty strong unit. She's typically built a little bit slower, so you do need to pay attention to a bit more tempo-based team, but as long as you're keeping her alive with the right support, she's a very strong solo DPS. Now, speaking of DPS units, we have, of course, Selene, the most popular unit in every single rank tier except Legend, right? In Legend, the most picked unit is actually Laia, but Selene is pretty much the most picked in every other league. The problem with Selene, though, is that she's not very consistent with her win rate. It's about a 50% or a sub 50% in most cases. 48 to 50% is typically okay, it's not the worst, but it just shows that there is counterplay to her even though she shuts down non-attack skills. She's really good into things like DDR, but she struggles into things like New Moon Luna and Knockwall that can definitely seal her and prevent her from moving. She's pretty good into Sea Phantom Politis as well, preventing her from using her S3. She's very punishing though, so when she works, and sometimes all you really need to do is have a presence on the field so that your opponent doesn't press buttons. But yeah, she's a very solid A-tier unit, incredible damage capabilities, incredible counterplay, and very annoying to fight against. Next up, we have a couple of very aggressive units, Eternal Wander, Ludwig, and Jacko. These are the two most popular bridge DPS units for aggro and cleave. They're also the most consistent units in general. Jacko gives the backline unit a higher chance to kind of inflict debuffs. She also has really strong damage multipliers. Same with Eternal Wanderer Ludwig. He is typically used in teams that carry a lot of souls, so you just keep repeatedly soul burn to push him up, and then when he takes a turn, he repeatedly soul burns to increase his damage output, and then he'll just end the finishing blow with his S3. Jacko, with her ability to push up when a person on the opponent's side is attacked with a debuff, she will go ahead and deal increased damage to those units, kill them with an S3 with the self self-attack buff, and then go with an S1. If that S1 hits and puts a debuff, she will be able to follow up with an extra attack, essentially going for a 2-for-1 or even a 3-for-1 trade, which is very nice. Jacko and Ludwig are both very strong. Not much else to say about them, but watch out for them if your opponent's playing aggressively. Midnight God Lilius, on the other hand, can be used in standard teams as well. She's actually changed in her build. So most people are kind of opting away from the middling speed of kind of 250, 260, 270 Midnight God Lilius is, and either doubling down on speed and going near 300 speed on their Galas, or they're just going slower and building resistance. So resistance Midnight God Liliuses are very scary because you can't really stop her from doing what she's doing. You can't strip her damage limit buff as well. So when people are tanking down, you might see Midnight God Lilius with things, let's say, like Abigail, or you see Midnight God Lilius with things like Crimson Armin or Arowell, which provide barriers that help with her damage limit buff and use it to her advantage. Now, Midnight God Lilius does have the ability to one-shot a lot of knights. She has kind of struggled a little bit because of the advent of Albedo, but also more common Crimson Armin picks to kind of counterpick this Midnight God Lilius. But her presence in the meta by herself has made a lot of knights irrelevant, so you won't see them in these higher tiered rankings. Alright, so moving on here, we have Fire Politis, also a really strong unit in general because, like Abyssal Euphine, she prevents the opponent from pushing up, and she's used against both cleave and aggro units, but also used against the anti-cleave units. You can use her to stop things like Sage Ball from cutting, use her to stop Eternus or Soul Consolation from pushing up Soul Weavers or Cleansers or the opponent's bridge units, while also enabling damage on your own and punishing people on the other side for using non-attack skills. Politis very good in general, but she can also be very versatile in her build. So she can be built aggressively with damage and a little bit of effectiveness. She can be built full effectiveness to kind of destroy these high-res units, or she can be built with a mix of resist and effectiveness for a degen build, typically very good at dealing with units like Genoa. Alright, moving on, we have Savior Aiden. Now, she is still, I would consider, an above-average unit. Very good versatile kit, very strong damage as well. Good protection for the team, and a good counterplay ability. With her S2 being an AoE counter. She has evasion, and she is typically pretty solid with good mitigation on your team. Even if your opponent lands a lucky hit onto her, chances are she'll survive if you have an Arwa or Crimson Armin, or even like an Albedo or something else on the team with Aureus. Right? So Savior Aiden is very good because she provides the whole team invincibility, well, besides herself, but typically you're not going to be attacking Aiden very much if you can help it. But yeah, she's still a very solid damage dealer, very straightforward unit as well, and her S1 carries Unbuffable, which is a pretty good debuff, especially because nowadays a lot of units aren't really building that much resistance. Alright, next up we have Specimen Says, who has kind of shown himself to be kind of a dark horse in this season. He does show up from time to time, not a very common pick, I would say, but I'd say still his performance is very strong. He does counter units with his Extinction, he has very high damage as well, so you don't necessarily need to stun somebody for him to kill them. If you build him with enough damage on a pen set and stuff, with his innate built penetration on his S3, he can easily kill a lot of tankier units as well. He has good damage with his S2, he has good stun capabilities. Overall, not too shabby. He has evasion built into his kit, so he can't get stripped or anything like that, and he can't get sealed either because he doesn't have a passive, so that's important to keep in mind. He's a very consistent unit, kind of more difficult to make work and more team comp oriented, but Specimen Says is a strong unit because Ambitious Tywin and Unbound Knight Arwell are both present in the meta, providing for easy combos with stuns. Moving on, we have some damage dealers. So Shaltir, very strong against evasion units in general, but also really good because if your opponent doesn't have AoE, then Shaltir is just going to kind of hang back, much like Spectre Tenebria did in metas past, except Shaltir has very strong burst with her S3 with a self-attack buff at the start of her turns, and she has injury on her S1 that is very oppressive against HP scalar units. She does have the Tempest Serum passive, so she can't take more than half her health as damage with every hit. However, it is kind of a downside too, because she's usually built weaker, and extra attack units are pretty common, along with dual attack units, right? Laia, see Lilius. You have Blood Moon Haste. If he S1s, there's a chance he can S2 if he strips a buff off Shaltir. And you have a lot of units that can kind of seal Shaltir as well, inflicting unbuffables and debuffs on her. So she is a bit vulnerable, but I think she is an above average damage dealer in general, kind of filling that role that Spectre Tenebria used to. Next up, we have Briarwitch Assyria. So Briarwitch is very strong because of her overall just passive blanket extinction effect that she has on the field, but with her advent of her EE making her defense break more consistent to an 85% chance to defense break, she is now very, very strong, especially because her defense break is AoE and she has increased hit chance overall, plus 50%, so it's really hard for her to miss evasion units despite it happening to me all the time. But Briarwitch Assyria is really good in terms of providing some support for the team. She can be built as an opener with really fast because she does have a 10 speed EE now. You can also build her at middling speeds, 240 to 250 speed, right? You can build her with a lot of damage and a bit of effectiveness, typically 85 to 100%, so you can defense break units without having to always rely on a soul burn. But yeah, overall, pretty versatile build here and a very strong unit to enable your team to deal damage. Next up, we have Lone Crescent Bellona. So the classic counter to things like ML Landy or other anti-crit units like Senya, for example, who's not really popular in the meta, but Lone Crescent Bellona also sports a lot of sustainability with her healing, especially when she gets into Sigurd range and she S2s, that's going to be pretty much bringing her back up to max health. Stacking attack, self-vigor buff, that can potentially be a team vigor buff if she kills. Lone Crescent Bellona is just a quintessential, like, just beat your opponent down with a lot of damage. Her Soulburn S1 multipliers are insane as well, and she pretty much guarantees damage against your opponents because she is a dark unit, so she doesn't have elemental disadvantage. On the same note, we do have Fire Ravi. Now, I did mention earlier that ice units are kind of struggling in this meta because you don't really have too many good ice DPS units that you can use to counterplay fire units, which is why Genoa's pretty dominant. But Fire Ravi here offers a lot of the same stuff that Lone Crescent Bellona does. She always crits, you don't need to build crit rate, she can be built really bulky, and she actually takes part of her HP stat and converts it to attack at the start of the match, which is really good for her. Fire Ravi is also really strong because the dominance of Earth units in this meta, surprisingly, with a lot of Laia, we have Albedo, right? You have a lot of these units that she has advantage over. Selene, for example, deals 30% less damage in RTA against fire units, which is really good for her survivability. Fire Ravi also does have a little bit of that counter shenanigans going on, much like Navy Captain Landy and Abyssal Yufine, but she does sport a lot more consistent heals, even when Sigurd's Scythe is not proccing, or even if you don't run Sigurd in general. So Ravi's healing comes from her S1. She also has good tempo with herself with her. Every time she's hit, she does push herself up in terms of combat readiness. She has an AoE attack with Fighting Spirit that doesn't really matter. Sometimes it does come in clutch with the stuns, right? But with the S1 having so much good value from healing from it, even things like Elvira or ML Politis on the other side don't really hurt her nearly as much as other units, because she doesn't rely on that S3 to win matches. Her Soulburn S1 also has insane multipliers, but so she can easily one-shot even tankier units. Right, next up we have Dragon King Sharoon. So I put her here in the A tier. Some people might say she's more situational, but I think even without stuns and sleeps, she is such a strong unit with the dominance of these knights and soul weavers in the meta. She's super strong against units like DDR, obviously, she counters sleeps and stuns. She's really good into A Tywin as well. It's a double whammy because DDR and A Tywin are typically picked together. She's really strong into things like just Albedo in general, Navy Captain Landy, Abyssal Yufine, because they're all knights and she can defense break them. She's good into Arwell because she can full buff strip the team, so it gets rid of the escort buff. She's good into Crimson Armin. When she puts the invincibility on, you get to strip all those buffs too, and she puts attack down on other DPS units, anything that's not a Soul Weaver or a Knight, which provides her a lot of good utility overall, even if you're not getting the Cascade buff and cleansing your team of sleeps and stuns. With her own stun and her S1, she actually does kind of pair well with Specimen Says too, so keep that in mind. Now, speaking of Soul Weavers, we have Moon Bunny and Infinite Horizon Acades. So these two units are kind of used to counter different openers. Moon Bunny is really good into units that take an extra turn, such as Conquer Lilius or Peyra. This is also one of the reasons why Conquer Lilius isn't really an S tier unit anymore, because New Moon Luna, Seafan, and Politis, they don't take extra turns, so Moon Bunny isn't going to impact those units at all, whereas she does shut down Conquer Lilius. Now, Moon Bunny, even though she does counter Knockwall still can reset the entire team, so even though you do get immunity and skill null on your team and you cleanse the bind, Knockwall still kind of did her job in providing tempo to the team, but Moon Bunny is still a decent counter into her, especially if you have something like Laia to follow up. Moon Bunny, in general, though, really good into these extra turn units. She is a little bit weak, though, because into stuff like DDR, because he can just hold off on his S3 and just S2 instead and push up his team and get tempo. She does have good tempo herself, providing attack buff and barrier and heals with her S3 if you're on Doctor's Bag, so you can push up the team pretty nicely and help them take the turn before your opponents. Now, next up, speaking of pushing up the team, Infinite Horizon Acades has an S2 that pushes up her team. Pushes up one unit in particular, while also cleansing 2 debuffs off of them, and she also has the ability of punishing widespread debuffs onto your side. So, she's really good this meta because, of course, New Moon Luna is a thing, and Infinite Horizon Acades doesn't care. She converts every debuff on your side of the field into a random buff that can actually help you quite a bit in the long run. She is pretty decent into a bunch of other units like Peyra and such as well, so yeah, her climb to above average rank is actually thanks to New Moon Luna, who kind of accelerated her potential here. Unfortunately, I don't have her, so I've never used her before, except in Draft Arena, but I have fought her before, and she is oppressive because of her constant combat readiness gain. Okay, so we're moving on to the average list now. These we're going to go through a bit faster than the S and the A. I felt like I needed to give more detailed reasoning for those units, but we'll go ahead and go through these as well. For the average units, for Straze and Architect Leica, these two units are pretty strong in general as 4th or 5th pick units, especially against slower teams. A lot of people now are tanking down with like ML Senya with Blood Moon Haste, so when you have these two units that can easily one-shot one of those two units, you're looking pretty good. They're slightly less versatile than something like Midnight Gala Lilius that provides a team-wide attack buff and pushes up the team. They're more selfish in what they do, but they do get the job done. Faithless Lidica is also here. She's a pretty decent option. A lot of Flitica cleavers are out there as well, running amok, and she's also a decent pick because she has Guiding Light, good against Zeo. If you guys are familiar with my anti-Zeo plays, she's a really core play in Zeo traps. Next up, we have Last Piece Corinne. She's actually a pretty decent unit overall, being a very fast damage dealer. Most people with competent Last Piece Corinnes have her about 290-300 speed. Some are 300 plus as well if you have the good enough gear for her. But yeah, she is really great, especially with her ability to dispel stealth now. So if you build her fast enough, you can actually go before units like Seafan and Politis, or even Knockwall with Guiding Light, and you can use Last Piece Corinne to easily finish them off. Alright, next up we have Bihu. Bihu's actually seen a little bit of a resurgence here. He used to be a counterplay into Midnight Gala Lilius, but as Midnight Gala Lilius became faster and faster, people started opting to go away from Bihu, and now people are taking a look at him as a counter to things like Navy Captain Landy. You might have seen him picked in the Epic Several Championships, but Bihu's now just built with a lot of attack, and he's used to inflict burns onto Landy, in which he'll clap and detonate them, and then Landy should go bye-bye in one fell swoop. He also provides the team quite a bit of good utility with an S3 that pushes up the team for tempo, and he sports an Unbuffable on his S3. Seeing a pattern with this tier list, Unbuffable's pretty good. Alright, moving on, we have Commander Pavel. I put him here on the average. He is good in aggro and cleave teams, but I think he's outclassed by units like Jacko and units like not Commander Pavel himself, but Eternal Wanderer Ludwig, right? Those two units tend to be a bit better in terms of synergizing with more units. Commander Pavel doesn't really synergize too well with units like Zeo, unless you build him on 100% crit and have him S1, but the fact that he needs his teammates to crit twice for him to get enough fighting spirit to go off is a little bit of a hindrance, especially because people can counterpick stuff like Navy Captain Landy, which can be a pain. Right, next up, top model Luluka is here. She kind of serves the same purpose as last piece Corinne. While she can't dispel stealth, she is super strong, and with her rearrangement of her kit, that buff that she got, with a Soulburn S3, she can actually demolish even some tanky units in general. Really good for cleaning up middling speed support units. Things like maybe Bunny Dom, for example, you can outspeed Soulburn and just nuke her into oblivion. So top model Luluka, very strong. She also has a buff for the team as well with attack buffs and CR pushing, so she is a good tempo unit even aside from her damage. Next up, we have Apocalypse Ravi, very solid unit in general, kind of fallen off a little bit, right, ever since Navy Captain Landy and anti-crit and stuff started popping up, along with all the injury with ML Shu and such, but as a 4th or 5th pick unit, she's very solid, because you can use her into Blood Moon Haste, she's good into ML Senya, she's very strong into these kind of tankier, lower damage comps, and she actually has good tempo, self-healing, CR pushing. While she is a selfish unit, she also provides some team support by going for S3 kills, which can revive, give your teammate the skill nullifier, and then have them take the turn. So you can kind of use her to snowball into a comeback. And her injury built into her kit is just very nice against the HP scaling meta. Alright, next up we have Archdemon Shadow. I put her in average. I wouldn't say she's above average. She's still kind of niche, but she can actually be used pretty consistently, actually, into certain units like Blood Moon Haste or Genoa. Being able to seal them really locks their damage output, and for Genoa's case, you can outright kill him if you seal into an extra attack, and if your Archdemon is built with enough damage, he's dead. So Arcdemon's actually pretty decent overall with so many passives running amok. She can be compared to units like Nockwell and New Moon Luna because they do seal as well, but they don't have as much damage potential as Archdemon, and they also definitely don't have as much staying power on the field. Nockwell is usually a bit squishier. You can build her tankier for sure, but Archdemon also provides the ability to deal damage, blinds, AoE hit, she has strips in her kit. Overall, pretty decent unit. I wouldn't say as good as Nockwell or New Moon Luna, because they have obviously better kits in general with AoE strips and such, and they have the ability to build much faster, but Arcdemon's still solid. Next up, we see Karina. So I put her in the average tier here. She kind of dropped from previous metas, mostly because right now ice units are not in a great place. There's a lot of earth units running around that can really hurt Karina. So namely Laya, for example, can really shut her down. And Karina's really weak to control units. So DDR, a Tywin, those units really put a damper on what she can do. New Moon Luna can also seal her right out the gate. You have unbuffables from units like Peyra. You also have units that can reset your S3s, like Wrecker and Rowana. So yeah, she's in a kind of a tough place, right? And Albedo with 3F is kind of comparable to what Karina used to be able to do with her Rocket Punch Gauntlet. Overall, still pretty solid unit in general. If your opponent's picking a lot of fire units, you could pick her. She does have a 50-50 matchup with like Fire Ravi. If you're on a counter Karina, you're in a better position, but if you're not, kind of hurts. She is decent to Shoutier though, and okay into as like an anti-cleave unit, but Albedo does do a bit more because as an anti-cleaver, her S2 being an AoE that can attack everybody and proc 3F is a little bit better than Karina, who has to take her turn to S3, and if she never gets to her turn, she won't be doing all that much. Next up, we have Last Rider Crow. I put him in the average category because immunity is still kind of decent. It's not a terrible a buff to have, even though we have so many strippers on the opponent's, even if your opponent has like strippers, right? So immunity is pretty solid in general to replenish and keep up throughout the fight, just so you don't get randomly sealed or randomly debuffed here and there. He's decent against AoE units, so but the issue is there's not really too many units out there that really want to use AoE. He's really weak into things like ML Shu. He's kind of outclassed by other knights at the moment. He's a decent counter pick into a Tywin because you can get his immunity up and a Tywin can't stun you, for example. But yeah, Midnight God Lily has essentially made Last Rider Crow kind of obsolete, right? She took him from one of the best units in the meta down to kind of just an okay so-so unit. He's still good though for his damage that he can put out, which isn't bad, but couple him with a cleanser or something else on your team and you could be doing okay. Just watch out for injury from DDR and ML Shu, right? Because those can be a problem. Speaking of problems, we have Silvertide Christie that can prevent problems from happening by putting a lot of effect resistance on the backline unit. She is a little bit more situational than, say, something like Abigail, I would say, because Silvertide Christie is a bit slower, she doesn't contribute much damage, and when she does take turns, she's not really doing all that much overall. She can be useful sometimes to provoke the opponent, but typically you're going to be using her to protect a backline unit or CR push in something like a Zeo Trap. The higher res can be useful if you are coupling her with already high-res units, like an Arya, for example, to prevent her from getting debuffed. In those situations, she's actually quite nice. But yeah, I'd say she's kind of an average unit. You can argue she's more niche, but in general, not too bad to have. Boosting the effect res of some of your slower standard units is never a bad thing, especially at a time where I'd say not many people are building full-on effectiveness on a lot of debuffers. Like even Bryce series and stuff are built with like 80 to 100 effectiveness, so you can survive certain attacks, right? And prevent debuffs from hitting your team. Next up, we have Troublemaker Crozet on kind of like a lower note than Silvertide Christie. They're on the same tier, but I'd say Troublemaker Crozet is a good substitute sometimes. If you just need a knight in a pinch, you can push up a teammate and cleanse and get some useful buffs. He does have a really strong passive that shares 40% of the damage taken by the unit in the back line, so it is even stronger than the escort buff from Arwell. I would just say that he's a bit more niche, not as good, and in general, just an average knight overall. Not exceptional, but not terrible either. Speaking of which, we have Angel of Light Angelica, so I put her here in the average tier, mostly because I wouldn't consider her above average. She's not really used all that often right now, and with the advent of even more cleansers hitting the meta scene with Infinite Horizon Acades right into prominence, she is not as good. However, she is a decent counterpick into certain units that rely on their skills or rely on taking turns, because she has a silence and she has a pushback in her kit, as long as an unbuffable, right? So she is pretty decent. She just doesn't provide enough damage output or provide consistent enough debuff application, because she can get cleansed, and when she does get cleansed, while she can turn cycle, typically she's also quite squishy too. So, you know, if you have units like Hand Guy, for example, on your team, you can cleanse her debuffs. If you have a high res unit like a DJB, or if you have a Laya, for example, Laya's kind of overshadowed Angel of Light Angelica a little bit, because Laya will just wait for Angelica to pop her S3, then you S2, cleanse everything, push up your entire team, and then you can finish off the Angelica pretty easily. So she is good into certain units, especially into certain teams that have a lack of cleansing, so that's why she is on the average tier. Normally people don't pick her that early anymore. She is usually picked as like a 4th or 5th pick now to kind of corner your opponent, right, based on their draft and punish them. Next up, I have Earth Sharoon and Ocean Breeze Luluka. Now, Earth Sharoon, I would say, is pretty good because she's actually an underrated answer into something like Laya, and she's also pretty decent with her Venom application and her cooldown increase on the opponent whenever she S1s and attacks somebody with Venom, right? So she can actually delay a lot of things like Laya's S3, she can help control things like Blood Moon Haste, prevent him from popping his S3. She's pretty decent overall with control. She also has full buff strips. She reduces the buff durations of all units on the opponent's side by 2 if she hits them with her S3, and she has good turn cycling as well. So overall, this is a pretty effective unit, not as impactful as some other units, obviously, which is why she's only an average. Compared to stuff like Bunny Dom, Infinite Horizon Acades, she doesn't provide as much, especially because she has no innate cleansing or healing, but she has a good buff application if you have a single DPS carry on your side. She provides a barrier at the end of every turn, as well as random buffs like attack buff, crit damage buff, and speed buffs and the like. Ocean Breeze Luluka has kind of fallen off as well. She used to be very, very strong, picked almost in every single match. However, with the advent of ML Politis in the meta, cutting focus gain in half, Ocean Breeze Luluka has been struggling to find her footing in this meta when she's so prominent. But Ocean Breeze Luluka, if ML Politis is not in the picture, is still pretty decent as a cleanser. She doesn't have very consistent cleansing though, so you know, in a meta where you're constantly getting bombarded by stuff like Knockwall's S2s every other turn, or ML Luna, right? She's gonna struggle a little bit more. She does have healing in the form of an ice cream buff, but again, still not a very consistent application. You need your S3 to get both the cleanse and the heal, and otherwise she's just S1ing, which does provide a bit of tempo to the team, but it's not quite enough in most cases. Alright, next up we have Mediator Cowrick. So Mediator Cowrick has started fallen off and risen again and fallen off in the last couple of metas, and now he's back in the picture. Most people have switched over from a damage build over to a faster build once more, 250-260 speed, and they use him to cleanse the debuffs of units like New Moon Luna. You do have to keep in mind though that he's still really weak to units resetting his S3, so things like Knockwall are going to pose an issue. So he's still kind of average, he's not terrible, but you have to pick him later in the draft, otherwise you're probably going to get punished. His immunity is also really strong, kind of like Last Rider Krau's, but unlike Last Rider Krau, Cowrick can actually cleanse your debuffs before giving you that immunity, whereas Last Rider Krau can't. So if you're stuck with an unbuffable, then you can't really do much about it if you're LRK. So moving on into the niche category. I'm going to go through these even faster than the average one, but starting off here we have Closer Charles, kind of fallen off a little bit. It's still used sometimes because his S3 is uncounterable for openers for aggro and cleave plays. I see him from time to time, but he's just not as popular as he used to be. Astromancer Elena prevents counterattacks, kind of self-explanatory there, why cleavers and aggro players would like to use her, especially if Navy Captain Landy or other units that are similar with counter abilities are on the other side. Elagos can be used to finish off certain units, perhaps stealth units or units you don't want to attack directly, like Savior Aiden, for example, if she's used on an anti-cleave team. So he's pretty decent for dealing damage. He's a good follow-up unit in general, especially after his buff that allows him to hit ice units more consistently. Ida is a really good bridge unit, still pretty niche, can't splash into everything, but with New Moon Luna being more meta now in the scene with aggro and cleavers using her, Ida is a really good bridge unit for when New Moon Luna uses a non-attack skill, so Ida can push up, then she can push up other units on her team with her AoEs. Now, Summertime Assyria, whenever a unit on your side use an AoE, you can push her up, and you can actually use her to just apply bombs to your opponent, and you can detonate those bombs and stun them. Same thing with Wandering Prince Sid. You just don't see these two very often because instead of debuffing your opponent, why would you do that when you can use Ludwig, Soulburn, and just kill them all? So that's kind of the playing with your food type of units right here with these two bomb units, but they're still very strong in general. Blooming Lidica, actually kind of seeing a little bit of a niche here. So I originally, when she was released, I was like, she's just really bad. In my opinion, she's still not as good as other units. Like if you're cleaving with Lidica, you might as well use Wandering, you're trying to wander Ludwig or Jacko or somebody else, right? But Lidica does have a good use against units that are super high in defense like Karina, or units that can't be crit normally, like Navy Captain Landy, or at least there's so much RNG involved, right? High like bulk threats like those can easily be taken care of if they're slow enough, which Lidica is pretty good at. Now, Lidica also has an S2 that provides an unbuffable. You're seeing a pattern here with why units are good, and unbuffable can actually stop a lot of units from getting extra buffs or skills on them, so she's actually pretty good in that regard too. She's pretty useless after her first S3, but typically she only has one job, and it's to kill the Navy Captain Landy or whatever slower unit is, tankier or slower unit is on the other side. Right? But yeah, keep in mind she does typically need to be accompanied by another damage dealer to kind of clean up the rest of the units. Alright, next up we have Fumir. So Fumir with DDR is actually pretty interesting because some aggro and cleave players actually use those two as anchors. As I mentioned with DDR, he was used as an anchor in some cases. Fumir with him actually provide a lot of utility with just sleeps. If you can't kill your opponent with your fast openers and DPSs, you would just put everybody to sleep. She also pairs really well with units like Midnight Gala Lilius. You can use her with Bihu. You can use her with Midnight Gala Lilius like Jacko and stuff too, like Jacko's fire, right? Synergizes really well with Fumir to get her 3 triple elemental wisdom stacks to be able to pop off her S2. So yeah, a lot of units in the meta currently help support her quite well, surprisingly. Alright, moving on, we have Araminta. This is a new unit that's kind of, just not new, like on release-wise, but popping into the meta new, because she is actually used to overwhelm a Tywin with all of his cleansing. So Araminta, you can use your S2. If you can put unhealables on all 4 units on the other side, she gains 120% combat readiness, takes the turn, then you can S3. So a Tywin would cleanse the unhealable on everybody, but then when you S3, there's an 80% chance to stun and 100% chance to apply 2 burns. So essentially what you do is you overwhelm a Tywin with so many debuffs, and you throw down the stuns with pretty much the same chance as a Tywin's AoE stun, by the way. And you can also Soulburn to ignore res. Typically you don't do that, typically you just put Abyssal Crown on her, and she does get the job done. She's used by a lot of high-ranking players to counter these kind of a Tywin teams, to buy your team some time, and to help your team recuperate, to kind of finish off these units on subsequent turns. Her burns actually do quite a bit of damage too, as long as you build some attack. Alright, next up we have DJB, one of my favorite pocket picks here. I didn't put him in the pocket pick category because I think he's actually pretty decent overall. The niche category is here so that because he can counter more than just debuffs, right? He's a good cleanser, obviously. With Eternus or Soul Constellation, he can counter things like New Moon Luna or ML Politis, and you don't really care too much about stuff like Knockwall and such because you have such high res, unless of course there's Soul Burning. You also have an S2 to Barrier Invert, which gives you a pretty decent matchup against protection set units like Crimson Armin. You're good against Arwell, and you're pretty decent against Blood Moon Haste or even Dragon Bride Senya. If you can't help but proccing their barriers, you can still punish your opponent for having those barriers on them. So overall, he's a pretty decent unit. The only problem is that he's very squishy, so he's not very commonly picked. You mostly see me use him against my opponents, but that's also because of my playstyle. I'm usually reacting to my opponents rather than initiating conflicts. Alright, next up we have Elena. So talking about initiating conflicts and such, Elena is really good at preventing your opponent from doing stuff to your team. She has a good AoE heal for everybody, she has good cleansing overall in her S1 and in her S3, and she does provide invincibility with a resistance buff, which is kind of nice, especially if you're trying to buy your time. If your opponent uses an AoE opener, like let's say Knockwall, and puts the bind and such on your team, and tries to stall your team for a turn and increases their cooldowns, Elena's usually built with enough resistance that she doesn't get affected, and then you can put invincibility on your team, and you essentially just ride out that first turn wave. Your opponent can't do anything to you, you can't do anything because your skills are reset, and then you just kind of sit there and wait for your next turn. She's also really good as an anti-cleave unit if she's built faster. Some people are switching her to Soul Constellation and stuff too, to kind of, you know, not necessarily rely on getting hit by an AoE, but if your opponent uses a non-attack skill, she will still cut and then apply the invincibility. So kind of like a what Crimson Armin does, but on a faster scale, with a bit more cleansing, right, as opposed to mitigation. Next up, speaking of cleansing, we have Destina, kind of seeing a small rise in the meta, sometimes, occasionally. I would argue still not as good as something like DJB, but her passive does give her a lot, or not passive, but her buff at the start of the match, Spirit's Blessing or whatever it's called, does give her extra resistance stats, so you could build her a bit faster. She is a bit slow in general, but you can try to build her a bit faster and on things, again, like Soul Constellation or Eternus, to try to counter stuff like New Moon Luna. She doesn't have a passive skill, so she can't be sealed, but she does have a revive as well, which is decent. She's just, in the end, kind of outclassed by things like Blood Moon Haste, but you know, if you're trying to go up against seal units, Blood Moon Haste is probably not the best option, and Destina can have, depending on your build, an impact, right? But sort of niche right now in the current meta. Rowana as well, punishes counterattack units, heals the team, CR pushes, kind of self-explanatory. Same with Bibulus, punishes counterattack units, heals your team, kind of defense breaks, strips your opponent's buffs. She's really nice, and if your opponent has something like a Navy Captain Landy, they're probably going to be banning your Bibulus more often than not. Next up we have Ed, so he punishes debuffers on the opponent's side. I occasionally do use him. I did beat Jintei with him, actually, when Jintei kind of banned the Edward, but Edward would be really good into those debuffer type teams, especially with openers. Even if they're ice units like Ron and stuff, Edward can still provide a lot. Edward with a Tywin can actually provide a lot of good utility, especially because Ed, sometimes your opponents will try to overwhelm him with debuffs, and they can't really do that when a Tywin's also simultaneously cleansing along with Ed's passive. They can't really keep him asleep and stuff with certain units, which is kind of cool. Next up we have Shu. Shu's a really good ice unit for a beat stick. Now she doesn't really provide a whole ton because she is a bit slow and she can be controlled. She does give herself immunity with S3 and anti-crit to the entire team, which is very nice, but you do have to keep in mind that she is very weak to injury units, and with ML Shu running around with DDR, with a lot of Earth units like Albedo and Laya and Celine, for example, on the other side, you might run into some issues. So she's more of a niche pick, pretty decent to some fire units like Fire Ravi, for example. If your opponents are picking that a lot, if you're fighting me a lot, then yeah, not terrible at all. You have seen her in the World Championship as well, namely as a pick into Fire Ravi, but yeah, she does have her place in the meta. She's just not very prominent right now. Same thing with Hua Young and Arunka, I would say. Hua Young, pretty decent overall, not as good as she used to be, obviously, before her nerf, but Hua Young has since been buffed to have some of that capability return to her. She's really good at destroying middling HP units, so support units like Bunny Dom or Infinite Horizon Acades, and those units can easily get their face kicked in by Hua Young, so she still has a place. It's just she's not a super popular pick because, again, she can be controlled, and she is a single target damage dealer, so you're at a slight disadvantage against a lot of the stealth units and such if you can't break them out of it. Arunka as well, single target damage dealer, can punish a lot of the barriers that you're seeing running around, especially if you can kind of predict what units are very commonly used on protection set. She can be okay, but do keep in mind that she is Earth, and there are very strong fire units currently in the meta, namely Genoa, right? And you do have units like Shaltir and Fire Ravi as well that are utilized quite often, so they can be pretty punishing. Rimuru, pretty decent into stuff like Midnight Galililius. He's actually kind of a wild card. He's kind of put in the niche category for being a wild card. You don't know what build he's going to be on, whether it's like 25k health or 200 resistance, or he's built with a lot of effectiveness, defense break the whole team on the opponent's side when he has 3s, or he might just be built on a ton of attack for Eubiris' Tooth, or just a ton of damage in general to nuke 2 units, one with his S2, one with his S3. You never know, right? He's also really good at just penetrating things with damage limit buffs or units with passives that prevent them from going past a certain amount of HP thresholds with each hit. So his extra splash damage is very strong, and one of the reasons why 3F is really good right now too. Okay, moving on, we have Senya. So Senya is a unit that is also pretty niche. She can be used sometimes as kind of an anti-cleave unit. I've seen some people with pretty interesting builds with that as well. She's also just decent in general for having anti-crit in her kit, which makes her kind of difficult to kill. You can use her in certain matchups, but she's not going to be super good and consistent because you do have to keep in mind that Fire Ravi and Emma Bologna and such are in the game and they guarantee crits, right? So she's kind of fallen off a little bit, kind of like Navy Captain Landy because of that. Next up, we have just a general damage dealer in the form of Zahak. He does have some self-survivability. He's kind of niche, but with Bryceria kind of getting her buff, she's kind of overshadowing him quite a bit. And Shaltir as well, just very similar to Zahak's kit. Kind of similar. Again, he doesn't have the stealth capabilities that the Shaltir has, but he is decent in general. I would say that he's more of like a pocket pick now that I think about it, but still kind of niche. He does do good damage, does have injury in his kit as well, some cleansing capabilities too, and he can be built really fast, especially because he doesn't care about building 100% crit rate. Next up, we have Lionheart Sirmia. She's fallen off a lot because of the Elvira and Emma Politis making their way into the scene, having the fighting spirit with Emma Politis and Elvira just locking her out of fighting spirit in general. You can't pick Lionheart too early anymore. She's still kind of a niche pick. It depends. I'm mostly seeing aggro or cleave users kind of 4th or 5th pick her, honestly, more than standard players using her. She is a little less consistent to ML Landy than things like Fire Ravi or ML Bologna, but she is really decent when you're fighting against units like Albedo, for example, that are used to counterpick, or Ed that are used to counterpick into your team. So you pick a Lionheart Sirmia, and when you cleave and you accidentally hit those units or crit somebody on the other team, Albedo, let's say counters, procs Lionheart will come in and destroy everybody that's defense broken by, let's say, Ron. So combo potential there that is still open, right? Little Queen Charlotte is also kind of niche. I'd say she's just a worse Savior Aiden still, even though she has Extinction in her kit and she's pretty good against dark units. It's just that most of the dark units that are prominent right now, let's say DDR for example, and Blood Moon Haste, they don't really care about Little Queen Charlotte all that much. Blood Moon Haste can potentially die to Little Queen Charlotte, but again, nothing stops Blood Moon Haste from S3 into Little Queen Charlotte, penetrating her defense and just destroying her. DDR can just control her to death as well. She can get reset by things like Requiem Rwana. It's just kind of a pain with all the debuffers going on. She doesn't have as much self-sustaining kit as Savior Aiden does with her evasion and her CR pushing. Next up, Spirit Eye Celine can be a pretty fun unit to use. She is used sometimes. It's just kind of difficult to use her right now because of so much true damage that's being outputted. Things like, for example, 3F, Rocket Punch Gauntlet, Rimuru's S3 Splash, right? A lot of splash damage that comes out from these units. And also a lot of extra attacks, dual attacks. You have Laia, you have Sea Lilias with dual attacks, Albedo with extra attacks, Haste with an S1 that can go into an extra attack. And as long as they're not critting the Spirit Eye Celine, she's not really going to be countering all that much. So yeah, she's going to have a tough time functioning. Not saying that she can't though. In certain circumstances you can definitely use her to your advantage with the reviving. Next up, Dilibet. She's kind of niche. She's pretty decent into certain team comps, I'd say. But right now, with so many resets from things like Knockwall, from things like Lua, or you can get sealed by Knockwall or ML Luna, with getting pushed back far enough that it doesn't even matter, from things like Zeo, maybe combo with an ML Politis, pushing her combat readiness so far back that even when she pushes herself up, it's not enough. People can stop her from pushing up with Abyssal Euphine or Fire Politis. She's in a tough spot right now, and there are better cleansers, but she is decent into something like maybe, let's say, DDR, for example, when they don't really have anything else that they're using against you, and you do bring her as like a secondary cleanser with somebody else, because she does act as a bruiser, and she is pretty strong. Next up, we have Remnant Violet. He's getting his buff, so that's cool, but we don't have his damage numbers yet. Right now, he's just a really strong beat stick, really good damage dealer. His evasion's going to be innate now, which is good. No evasion buff on him, which is kind of nice. But again, keep in mind he can still be sealed by units, so it is kind of hard to run him in a meta where you have so many fast openers that will definitely take turns before he does. Next up, Infernal Kawazu and ML Ken, kind of both fallen off a little bit more than they were before. They were used a bit more before because of Navy Captain Landy, for example, and her salvo proccing the Infernal Kawazu. He can just go ahead and one-shot the Landy. I feel like Bihu became the new tech this season over ML Kawazu, but a lot of people still have him built because he's still pretty strong to some AoE units, right? For example, Albedo can proc him, a Tywin can proc him, and he will self-cleanse and give himself immunity, push himself up, and give himself vigor, which allows him to ignore res and kind of one-shot things. The problem with him one-shotting things though is that so many units are either really squishy and you're wasting that damage on them, or they're just really tanky and you'll never kill them even if you have like 5k attack, for example. So he's kind of in the weird position where he's good against like middling HP units, like maybe Navy Captain Landy or like some Soul Weavers, but he's never going to one-shot the tanky knights and stuff that are sitting around. So that's his issue right now. ML Ken is pretty decent in general, obviously good into things like ML Landy with his guaranteed crits and for punishing her by provoking her and forcing her to attack him and he'll kick her face in. He's good at punishing AoE units too, like Abyssal Euphine. He's good at punishing Bellion, for example, but he is weak to control. There are a lot of units nowadays that have high amounts of effectiveness, or units that just can seal him, or units that can just one-shot him too. So it is kind of tough. Immunity is really good at fighting him, but again, you do have a lot of chip damage units like Albedo with 3F and stuff that really won't be critting, and you have units like Celine where even with some damage mitigation, you know, if she soul burns an S3 and she has an attack buff, maybe a vigor buff, or maybe even a rage buff from ML Politis and such, you can pretty much one-shot most ML Kens because they're not super tanky because they do need to build damage as well. Yeah, he's in a little bit of a rough spot, but he's still usable in the right situations. Usually picked last, 4th or 5th pick into stuff like Navy Captain Landy if she's a sole DPS unit. I put Spectre Tenebria here as niche as well. I feel like she's kind of outclassed right now by Shaltir. Shaltir is faster, does more damage, pretty consistent overall with injury application too. Spectre Tenebria is just kind of slower. She doesn't do as much. She can hold book, yes, but she doesn't really do much to contribute to the team. She's a pretty selfish unit. Good damage output overall. I still like her on Lifesteal set, but with so many AoE units in the meta right now, and so many tanky units, I should say, that Spectre really can't burst through. Like, her whole team's gonna crumble before she has a chance to finish off the opponent's team if she's a sole DPS unit. Moving on, we have Solitaria. Solitaria, being a Floodgate unit, pretty good against focus units, and her debuffs are really nice in general. She's good into things like ML Shu, she's really strong into things like a Tywin as well. You can kind of overwhelm the team with debuffs with him. She's good because she does have things like Unbuffable and stuff like that in her kit too, but it is more random, so you do have to be careful with that. In general, she's okay. I would say she does have some weaknesses against certain units like Ed, for example, that can counterplay her, or like Lionheart, but those aren't very common units to see. Solitaria is mostly used as a floodgate against focus units, namely ML Shu nowadays. But yeah, overall still decent, especially if your opponent doesn't have a cleanser. She's going to be very strong. Elvira is also pretty niche. She's not very picked very often, but if you see Fighting Spirit units on the other side, Abyssal Yupim for example, they're pretty much never going to be able to do anything. Units like Abyssal Yupim rely on their S3 to get their actual killing blows, so if you have Elvira, you're pretty much never going to die, as long as your team's tanky enough and can sustain and also chip away at that Yupim without any problems. But yeah, Elvira's solid unit, again, Floodgate unit, kind of like Solitaria for Fighting Spirit, but still niche, not very widespread use, because she doesn't have any damage really, she just provides good utility. Next up we have some anti-cleave units like Armin, good for countering and some damage, Sage Ball for cutting and sleeping your opponents. They're kind of less popular nowadays, especially because we have so many different units like Abyssal Yupim and Politis to stop people from cutting. You have seals from New Moon Luna or resets and stuff from Knockwall. It's just kind of difficult to pull off something like Sage Ball right now. BBK is also decent, but she can get her immortality stripped early on if you don't have enough resist. And Kayron's actually alright if you're fighting against more traditional cleavers like Ron, Zeo, Cleaves, and such. If he gets his evasion buff and everything, if you're on Double-Edged Decrescent, he's actually not terrible. But again, very RNG oriented. Sometimes you just want to go for a more stable anti-cleave option, so that's why he's not seen very often. Assassin Cartusia and General Purgus are good combat readiness boosters for your team. They are also pretty decent against faster teams to kind of screw them over. You can cut with Assassin Cartusia and stun somebody, kind of like how Sage Ball would cut and sleep. And you also have General Purgus, who can push up your team whenever he's hit. Typically use him with stuff like Christie and some stealth units, so the only units they can hit are units that will push up your combat readiness, and they can help your team cut, right? All these are kind of anti-cleave units. These units right here, Sid and Veronica, they're actually decent as damage dealers. They're also speed imprints, by the way, it's why they're here. But Sid is a really good damage dealer, very strong at cleaving. I'd say almost like the same level as Jacko, actually. Maybe he can go up there, but I don't see him all too often, because not many people are speed contesting cleavers right now. If they're cleaving, one person's probably just going to be like, alright, cool, and then just double down on some tankingness, at least from what I've seen. But yeah, Sid and Veronica here are pretty decent overall. Wander Silk, Watcher Shuri, Vildred, Shuri, and Surin. These are, like, as you go more to the right, they're more desperate for speed imprints. So if you're speed contesting, you might have these units built and to boost up your unit's speeds. Last but not least, I put Araz in the niche category. It's niche because if you are lacking things like Dragon Bride Senya, like, Araz can sort of be like a budget replacement. If you're kind of just getting into RTA, he's not terrible. So have him built up. I don't know what I'd probably put him in like the average category. He's not really used in RTA, but when he is, he kind of has like around a 50% win rate. He's picked like 0.5% of the time, so once in every 200 matches maybe he's picked, but he does have a decent win rate in Legend, but then again, almost every unit does. He has like a 58% win rate in Legend or something like that, but in all the other categories, he's all like 47 to 50% win rate. He's an average knight, I would say, pretty decent. He doesn't provide burst in his own damage, but if you S2 and you defense break somebody and your DPS unit comes in, that's a pretty decent enough burst, I'd say, that warrants him to be in the niche category. Alright guys, so let's go ahead and tackle one of the last categories here, the pocket pick category. So looking at this, we have units that are kind of just used because they are people's favorites, or they're kind of used because they're, you know, kind of useful in certain situations. I wouldn't call them niche, but I guess they're kind of fun units to pick, right? They do serve a purpose at times, so we'll go over them here. Silverblade Araminta is the first one. She's actually a unit that can be used in conjunction with other aggro cleave teams. You kind of switch from your aggro cleave team into a more control-based team, which is kind of funny, I'd say, at times. She's actually pretty decent because you can just stun the entire team on the other side and buy your team another turn to come back around, loop, and then finish everybody off. She's not a very conventional unit. You know, like I said, you'd rather just kill somebody with Ludwig or Jacko, or maybe even Commander Pavel or Boudica or something like that, rather than play around and toy with your units, kind of like Caesarea or Wandering Prince Sid, right? So next up we have Fairy Tale Tenebria. She's actually been kind of picked here and there. Kind of like Araminta, she's starting to see a little bit of a rise. She does have an unbuffable in her kit, and she does have Redirected Provoke. Kind of cool, but in general, she's just a little slow to compete with other openers. She's good as a 4th or 5th pick unit, though. Kind of fun to surprise your opponent with, and most of the times, more often than not, she is going to get banned, because if you're picking her 4th and 5th, it means your opponent's kind of unprepared to deal with her. Same thing with Command Model Leica, much like the other units, she kind of just provides a lot of control to your team. So starting off the match, you can start with an AoE Sleep, right? You don't normally see this with a lot of the meta openers right now. ML Lua, ML Politis, Nockwall, Lua, Pera, Sea Lilius, those kinds of units. Even like Zio and Ron, they don't inflict control-based debuffs, they more just inflict kind of seals, they inflict defense breaks, they inflict stuff that prevents the opponent from moving, like Bind, or they sleep, like with Lua, on a single target, but at most you're just stripping debuffs off your opponents, right? Normally you don't see a lot of AoE control, but Leica's a little different here. She can be used, and she has a dual attack in her kit as well. Arbiter Vildred I kind of put here as a pocket pick. I've seen some people with his EE like go around and just start cleaving things. It's really funny to see. But Arbiter Vildred is kind of undetermined right now, I'd say. I put him in a pocket pick here because I don't think he's bad. It depends on how you build him. You can build him like triple torrent, full damage nuke that just revives and just nukes everything. Or you can build him as a anti-cleave unit. Something like counter, more bulk, right? You just have him survive, and if he dies and comes back, he has evasion, he has a bit more protection, he can survive for a little longer, who knows, right? So we'll see how he plays out here, but as of right now, he's always been a fun little pocket pick for a lot of players. Researcher Carrot too, she can be used actually to burn a lot of units as well. Decent into things that have anti-crit, and again, fire units are in a pretty decent spot right now because there's not too many ice counters. For Researcher Carrot, there's a bit more like Shu and Arya and Karina. They're all pretty good into her, but again, those ice units are pretty much countered by stuff like DDRE Tywin, other control units. So Researcher Carrot, depending on team comp, can actually come in pretty clutch. Her burns are pretty high damage. Roy Mustang, kind of like a Sylvan Sage Vivian, I'd say, but more consistent than her in general. His S3 deals a ton of damage. He's weak against ice units, but again, like I mentioned, ice units are kind of weak this meta right now. They don't have too many great DPS options, so he is pretty good into neutral teams, and against chip damage units that don't have like 3F and stuff, he's actually pretty solid at staying alive. But you definitely do want to run him with barriers and such to make sure that he doesn't die so quickly. Chatty is an ideal artifact for him too. Fire Charlotte, kind of in a pocket pick. You do see some people bring her out here and there. I'd say Fire Ravi is just a better Charlotte nowadays, but in the World Championships you saw people pick her out sometimes as well into opponents with anti-crit units, like for example ML Landy. So she is definitely there, but not very not picked very often. Same thing with Fire Lilius, you do see her picked from time to time. Normally she sees higher play with more Luas running around, although Luas can counter her with things like Song of the Stars. So yeah, Lilius is definitely okay. She has some dual attacks as well. She has cleansing in her kit. She can self-cleanse when the opponents use non-attack skills. So overall, decent. Next up we got Brig. Brig is someone that people have been experimenting with from time to time. I do know that some people have been using him into like a Genoa. You S3 into the Genoa, and if your S3 gets him to lethal damage, you actually strip the immortality, and you could potentially kill him just like that. But yeah, it is interesting to see. But Brig in general, one of a few like ice units I'd say like kind of acts like a bruiser similar to Shu, but he provides more utility with stripping and defense breaking and such more so than protecting a team with anti-crit. So he's a more aggressive version of Shu, I'd say, although way less RNG. He does have the extra attack as well, but he's based on fighting spirit unlike Shu. Shu is based on focus, but she doesn't need focus to S1 and Foosh into somebody, right? Whereas Brig needs to build up his fighting spirit, so he's a little bit less used because of things like Emmopolitus, for example, that can shut him down. Next up we have Lethe. Lethe's good with her extinction. She's a bruisery ice unit. Again, you see a lot of these ice units come out as like pocket picks. They really come out of the woodworks if your opponent's picking more fire units. Lethe has been picked several times, many times into my Fire Ravi. I end up banning her a lot just because she's hard to deal with sometimes. If you have elemental disadvantage, it's really difficult to kill Lethe, kind of like how it's difficult to kill Laya. I'd say Lethe is just like a prototype version of Laya, and Laya has a better typing right now for the current meta, and she has a bit more utility with cleansing the team and such. Lethe is pretty decent. You just need 3 stacks of Omen to get almost a lethal shot on somebody, especially because if you get Frostbite, it's a lethal shot because you ignore damage sharing. But yeah, Lethe in general, decent pocket pick. Next up is Seaside Bellona, kind of surprising, but a lot of people are building like really high damage Seaside Bellonas, and they do have her on like Destruction Set and stuff. They don't have her on Lifesteal with Drink, so she can actually be a pretty explosive unit in terms of DPS plays, so not bad in general. We also see Summer Break Charlotte. She used to be used in like cleave and aggro teams, but she kind of fell off because obviously there's better options now. And Summer Break Charlotte, pretty decent because she doesn't allow the opponent to counter. You can actually build her pretty slow and use her on Unity sets and stuff to increase her chances of dual attacking. Just keep in mind that AoE dual attacks right now, they're not the best thing ever because you do have a lot of units that can punish those AoE hits, right? The good thing is, again, she can't be countered when she does those AoE hits, so there's a little less chance of retaliation from the opponent, but yeah, just keep in mind that she isn't as consistent as other damage dealers out there, but she can definitely work. Next up we have Yolha. So Yolha's here mostly because Midnight God Lily has made a lot of knights obsolete. You see that like LR Crow I'd like categorize as average. You could kind of maybe categorize Yolha as sort of average-ish. She could be used as a pretty decent knight, but she does have cleansing in her kit. She's very selfish. She self-cleanses herself, and she has redirected provokes and such, and a revenge kill with her S3, but in general, she doesn't provide as much team support, and most of the units now in the current meta are pretty team support based. She also struggles against injury units like ML Shu, like DDR, and she can still get one-shot by Midnight God Lilius's, although if you pair her with Abigail, it's a little less dangerous. Moving on, we got just regular Landy, not Navy Captain Landy. Earth Landy is kind of okay. She's not the best unit nowadays anymore. She's still a good tank buster sometimes, especially if your opponent doesn't have AoEs. It's really rare for your opponent not to, but if they do, you can use her and sit back and relax and just slam S3s into your opponent and not care about anything. So she still kind of does what she used to do. I know people build on like slower, tankier builds now. Some people are faster. She has a lot of different variety. The most popular one I've seen is kind of a faster Landy, right? Less bulk, way less bulk, and just way more damage. You're just kind of trying to nuke your opponent down as soon as possible. It can work, but just keep in mind AoEs will be the end of her. Next up, we have Immortal Wukong. So Wukong here is not really used in PvP all that often. He saw a little bit of use at the beginning when he was released. People were trying him into Genoa, and then everyone started building resistance Genoas, so Wukong just kind of fell off. He's still a good little pocket pick. I guess you can categorize him as niche too. Again, B, C, and D kind of all meld together in terms of their rankings, but he's decent against Blood Moon Haste, into Laia. He's decent against ML Senya. Any units that penetrate defense, he's actually pretty good against because he doesn't take that much damage against them. He also has anti-crit built into his kit, which is nice. He has usually built on lifesteal. He's good with his S3 self-attack buff, does increase damage proportional in difference between attack stats, so he's great at finishing support units like Soul Weavers and Knights. Overall, not terrible, but his win rate also isn't that great, so yeah, overall, kind of niche, kind of a pocket pick. If you like him, you have certain places that you can use him. Ezra, I'm putting him in a pocket pick here, and he's not very popular overall, but if you're a control player and you like playing with debuffs, oh boy, Ezra is the unit for you, because you're just inflicting every debuff ever onto the opponent, and then you deal a ton of damage based on how many debuffs they have. So, there you go, a 3-star. Next up, speaking of debuffs, if you like debuffs, Benevolent Roman is also really strong against things like ML Politis. When they use a non-attack skill, he can cut with his new EE, and then you can go ahead and rip your S3 and silence everybody. You can Soulburn with him if you want, if you're holding Book. You can combo him with stuff like your own Requiem Rowana, right? So when Roman takes a turn, he S3 silences everyone, Rowana goes, pushes everybody back, resets them by a turn. You can even combo him with stuff like Araminthas, for example, the Silverblade Aramintha. You can counter him with Blitica. You can combo him with so many different units. It's actually kind of funny. He's just not consistent by himself though, so it's kind of a gamble. High risk, high reward, kind of a pocket pick. People have been kind of taking him for a spin. I wouldn't say he's fully niche in the category because he's not as consistent as a lot of the characters in the niche category are, but he is okay. He's a fun unit to use. Next up, we do have ML Rin. She has a really high base speed. I don't really see many people use her, but occasionally you see people pick her out and just obliterate people with it. Again, pocket picks don't have to be popular picks. They're just people who like these units, and they are decent. Like, you can stun people with her pretty easily. But yeah, overall, she doesn't provide too much aside from that, so people don't really use her all that much. Her S3 is good for stripping, and her S2 and S1 are okay for stunning. But other than that, she doesn't provide too much for the team. So if you're looking for stuns though, Solitaria is pretty decent, or even Pirate Captain Flan. One of my favorite pocket picks. You just use her when an opponent has no cleansing, and you just throw bombs everywhere and just nuke everything. It's pretty cool. You should try it out sometime. I also put Bad Cat Armin in here because I've seen a few people, when they pick solo DPS teams, they pick Bad Cat Armin and they kind of use the DPS like as a counter beat stick. Pretty good for certain units that benefit from S1ing a lot. Can be used with stuff like Fire Ravi, can be used with stuff like Abyssal Yufine or Navy Captain Landy and the such. Really good into AoE teams where they're kind of forced to hit the Bad Cat Armin, or teams that don't have cleansing because then you can provoke everybody with her, and it's not bad. Last but not least, we have Dark Corvus here. Dark Corvus is just really solid in general. If your opponent has AoEs, like Abyssal Yufines and stuff, he has Extinction in his kit, by the way, so hey, who's gonna ramp up first, Abyssal Yufine or Dark Corvus? Who knows? But Dark Corvus is also really good into low damage teams, so when people are trying to chip away at you with like a Tywin and all that stuff, Albedos, you can just not really care. He is really vulnerable to injury, so careful with DDR and ML Shu. You're never gonna draft him into those units anyway, but he is unable to be stunned, so do keep that in mind. If you're up against units that can stun, he's pretty solid. He's also not a knight, so he won't get defense broken by things like Dragon King Sharoon. Just a little fun fact for you guys who are considering using him. Okay, and here we are, as my voice is giving in, we're gonna look at the last category, unfortunately the suboptimal category. Pretty much every other unit that's not listed in this list right here is suboptimal, but these are the more commonplace units that you might see questions asked about. I know a lot of other units are PvE and I left them out of this list, but Benimaru, the extra turn shenanigans, doesn't really work too well with ML Luna, ML Politis and such, and you don't really gain too much benefit from proccing off of something like a Knockwall and things on the other side, because you already reset anyway. You might get some value out of fights against like C. Lilius and such, but Honestly, Bunny Dom is way better in those scenarios because you get full team support, and Benimaru's damage is kinda lacking a little bit, especially if you want to build some bulk on him to make him survive. Next up is Milim. I'd say just kind of outclassed by the last piece Corinne buff, so unfortunately for Milim, she's kind of suboptimal here. You can't really build her as fast as last piece Corinne, and last piece Corinne gets the job done with Dispelling Stealth with the faster units. Winter is just too inconsistent. She's okay into certain units, like back then into Destina and such, but because Destina fell off the meta, so did Winter. She was also just the 15% magnet. If you didn't land your 2-turn stun, it was pretty much over, unfortunately. Also, the advent of anti-crit, like with Navy Captain Landy on the other side, prevented her from dealing consistent damage with her S3 too. Teiyu, people thought after his buff he'd be pretty decent, but turns out not really. He's still kind of suboptimal and doesn't really accomplish his job, which is cutting after like a person using a non-attack skill. Again, you have things to prevent that like Abyssal Euphine and Politis, but you also have so many units that can just reset his skills and stuff too, so it doesn't really matter in the end. Champion Zerato is just a weaker version of Ed right now. There's not many units that just constantly throw out debuffs, and if they need to, they can just seal Champ C. Champ C, when sealed, can still return the debuffs if he takes a turn to S1, but he's typically so slow that he's never gonna really happen. Alright, next up we have some Soul Weavers, Ahmed, Amelia, Brigitte, and Shuna and Maid Chloe. These guys just kind of pale in comparison to the other ones that we've mentioned, like Infinite Rise and Acades, Bunny Dom, DDR, right? They provide so much more utility to the team. Ahmed is weak against Politis and Celine, and the advent of all these people countering these non-attack skills early in the match. If someone's starting with a non-attack skill, right, they're going to be trying to cut Ahmed, right? Same with Amelia, they're going to try to cut her when she CR pushes. Brigitte, really nobody uses her, so she's kind of undetermined in her placement. Maybe she's good against solo DPS units. I think she might be, but she's also kind of iffy too. She ignores res, yeah, but it's interesting to see how she'll play out as the meta changes. Shuna, I'd say just go for something like a DJB or something like an Elena over a Shuna. She does provide some sleeping and such, which is kind of cool, but she's kind of a mixed bag. If you're going for the sleeps and such, you want to build some effectiveness too. So she's a mix F and res unit sometimes. I'd recommend just building her pure resistance to try to get it up as much as possible. She's also a relatively slow unit, so she's not going to be cutting very well, even with stuff like Soul Constellation or Eternus. Maid Chloe, unfortunately, Blood Moon Haste every time he's around. Maid Chloe's just irrelevant. Originally, Blood Moon Haste punished people from reviving, right? So Maid Chloe got caught in the crossfire when he was released to counter Arby. But now Blood Moon Haste is just a better Maid Chloe because he has the damage, he has the strip, he has the sustain. That's better than Maid Chloe, but he can also revive the team, which is very fun. So rest in peace, Maid Chloe. We got injury units in the form of Ilanov, Alencia, and Mort, but ML Shu's just better, so unfortunately, these three are not very consistent. We've seen them try to be used before, and they just don't have enough damage. Ilanov and Mort's S1s don't really do all that much by themselves. Mort can defense break and ignore res, but in most cases it's not enough because people can just cleanse it before the next DPS unit can take a turn. You're not really speed tuning Mort to a team, right? Same thing with Alencia. While she can inflict mass amounts of injury damage to a single unit, she's typically slower, and there are certain fire units that are really strong in the meta right now, like Fire Ravi, for example, and you're going to be hard-pressed to have Alencia work out nicely, especially with so many debuffers and control units running around, right? And Unbuffable being such a popular debuff in this meta just prevents her from getting Mind's Eye, which prevents her from attacking at her full potential. Ice Tywin could actually be a decent unit, but they made it so that the unit in the backline has to be hit while they're slept or stunned in order to cleanse the sleeper stun. So he can't really counter DDR, and DDR being so prevalent in the meta right now, it's unfortunate for Tywin. Crow has kind of fallen off too. He used to be like a decent, okay, general average pick, but because of Minigat Lilius, Crow's just kind of fallen off completely. Yolha's a slightly better option than Crow, just because she's a bit more self-sufficient than he is. He is a way less selfish unit than Yolha, but I'd argue that they're both kind of, I mean, I guess you can argue that Crow's a pocket pick-ish, but I see more people pick Yolha than Crow, just because Yolha has the potential to reflect damage people and kill them, whereas Crow just kind of sits there and soaks up damage. Twisted Eidolon Kron. I don't think I need to explain this, but I think they need to revisit the drawing board on him, unfortunately. Kalric, Kisei, Tempest Surin, they're all just classic DPS units. They're just not enough. Even though they're pretty fast units, they're not fast enough to go against these openers, and because they need to build damage, and it's hard to build damage and speed at the same time. But they also don't have too much protecting them either. Tempest Surin as well just fell off as a anti-cleave unit and such. Seals, extra damage, splash damage, true damage, all that stuff hurts Tempest Surin quite a bit. Operator Sigrid just kind of fell off as a unit just because if you want a team-wide attack buff, Closer Charles is better. You just use Closer Charles and it's uncounterable S3. You actually, if you hit things like Aiden or Albedo, you proc their S2. They can't counter because it's uncounterable on the Closer Charles, but it puts them on cooldown. But Operator Cigarette can't do that. And even though you can try to punish people that have barriers, Operator Cigarette doesn't give herself any damage buffs at the start of her turn, so she can't one-shot any of these tanky units with barriers anyway, so it's unfortunate. Judge Kisei, despite her buffs, kind of just not really doing all that much. You're better off using Astromancer Elena and using other damage dealers, with Elena as kind of a bridge unit and as kind of a support unit. Judge Kisei is just not consistent enough with her debuffs, and she's not consistent enough with her damage either to rely on for killing. Sylvan Sage Vivian, as in her current state, she's suboptimal, but with her buffs she might change, but as of right now, in her current pre-buff state, she's suboptimal. I'd say Roy is arguably a little bit better, even. Assassin Coley and Ace Sid, they used to be pretty decent at countering fast units, but nowadays with so many units being in stealth, like I mentioned, even Zeo struggles a little bit. You're going to be hard-pressed to hit like anything, really. Besides like maybe a Ron, but even in most cases, Rons now are so fast that they outspeed even like counterpick Acids, because if you're trying to kill, you're building damage, and you're probably not going to be as fast as a Ron. So yeah, with that being said though guys, that is the entire tier list here. I know it's a really long video, but hopefully you guys use the timestamps below to help break down the video, make it more digestible and consumable. But let me know what you guys think of the tier list in the comments section down below. Love to hear from you guys. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more Epic 7 content. And until next time, take care.